At 10:52 in the morning, on April 29, 1945, Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann stood outside a stone church in the village of Tenterden, Kent, listening to organ music and voices singing, filtering through the arched wooden doors, trying to understand what was happening. 23 years old, captured 9 weeks earlier in the Rhineland, transported across the English Channel on a military transport, expecting a prison camp that looked like the ones he had been warned about in Wehrmacht briefings. Isolation, harsh treatment, forced labour without respite. Instead, the British Army sergeant standing beside him, a man named Davies, was holding the church door open and gesturing for Zimmermann to enter. And Zimmermann had no idea if this was a test or a trap. The sergeant's face was unreadable. Davies had told Zimmermann and the other 11 Germans waiting outside that they were invited to attend the Sunday service. Zimmermann thought he had misunderstood the English, a church service in the middle of enemy territory in the final days of a war. The logic refused to connect. Zimmermann had surrendered to American forces on February 18th near Düren. His unit, the 9th Panzer Division, had been caught in a massive artillery barrage while attempting to defend a river crossing. When American infantry advanced through the smoke at dawn, Zimmermann and 74 other men dropped their weapons and raised their hands. The Americans had been efficient. They disarmed the prisoners, separated officers from enlisted men, processed them through a field collection point where hundreds of German soldiers sat in wire enclosures waiting for transport. Zimmermann spent 6 days at that collection point before being transferred to British custody and loaded onto trucks heading west to Belgium. The Channel crossing took 7 hours. The military transport carried 160 German prisoners below deck. The conditions were cramped, but not brutal. Too many bodies in too little space. The smell of diesel and unwashed uniforms. The constant anxiety that the ship might hit a mine without anyone topside, knowing Germans were aboard. When the ship docked at Dover on February the 27th, Zimmermann had not eaten hot food in 8 days. British military police marched the prisoners onto trains. Zimmermann's group travelled south through Kent, past Canterbury's damaged cathedral, into the countryside beyond. The landscape changed. Bombed towns gave way to rolling farmland, then to villages with medieval churches and half-timbered houses. The countryside looked nothing like the devastated Germany Zimmermann had been defending. It looked preserved, intact, like war was something that had happened elsewhere. By the time they reached Camp 12 near Ashford on March the 1st, Zimmermann understood he was deep inside Britain, surrounded by people whose cities Germany had been bombing for 5 years. People who had every reason to hate him. Camp 12 sat on 70 acres of requisitioned farmland, 5 miles southwest of Ashford town centre. The base had been constructed in 1943 as a holding facility for prisoners awaiting assignment to labour programmes. By early 1945, it housed 520 German prisoners of war. Zimmermann and his group were processed through the intake building on the western perimeter. They were photographed, fingerprinted, issued British Army uniforms dyed dark brown with large white POW patches sewn onto the back and shoulders, canvas boots, wool blankets, a metal tin and spoon. They were assigned to huts, corrugated steel structures with concrete floors and small coal stoves. 15 men per hut. Each man received a metal cot, a wooden footlocker, and a hook for hanging personal items. Zimmermann had expected concrete bunkers and armed watchtowers. Instead, he found something that looked like a work camp. The huts were cold but dry. The latrines had running water and functioning plumbing. The mess hall served hot food twice a day. On his first night at Camp 12, Zimmermann ate potato soup, brown bread, margarine and tea with powdered milk. Not generous portions, but more food than he had seen in the last 6 weeks of fighting in Germany. He sat at a long wooden table with other new arrivals and tried to understand what kind of prison fed its inmates soup and tea with milk. A Feldwebel named Becker, another prisoner who had been at Camp 12 for 5 months, explained the situation. Britain had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention. The convention required that prisoners of war receive adequate food, housing, and medical treatment. Britain was following the rules, though with modifications. British civilians were under strict rationing. Meat, butter, sugar, eggs were all controlled. The prisoners would receive similar rations to British civilians, sometimes less, but always enough to meet minimum convention standards. They would work agricultural labour, mostly, helping Kent farms that had lost workers to military service. They would be paid small amounts in camp vouchers. They would receive adequate clothing and shelter. They would not be executed or tortured or starved. Becker said all of this while eating his soup, and Zimmermann realised the Feldwebel was telling the truth. This was not propaganda. This was policy, constrained by wartime scarcity, but still policy. The work began on March 5th. Zimmermann and 38 other prisoners were trucked to farms 6 miles east of camp. The farms stretched across the Kent countryside, fields being prepared for spring planting. The farmer, a man named Barrett, explained the job through an interpreter. Each prisoner would help with farm work: ploughing, stone clearing, fence mending, ditch digging. Work hours were 7 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with a 1-hour break for lunch. The labour was hard but straightforward. Once the day's quota was met, prisoners could rest. Barrett made it clear that cooperation benefited everyone. The farm needed labour, the prisoners needed occupation. Neither side gained from hostility. Zimmermann started working at 7:15 that first morning. The labour was physical. Dig the trench, clear the stones, repair the fence line, move the posts. The March weather was cold compared to the Rhineland in February, but the repetition wore him down. By 9 o'clock, Zimmermann's hands were numb. By 11 o'clock, his back ached from bending. By noon, he understood why Barrett had emphasized that finishing early meant rest. The faster he worked, the sooner he could stop. Zimmermann finished his section by 4:35 in the afternoon. He stacked his tools in the wagon and walked to the barn near the farmhouse to report completion. Barrett checked the work, examined the fence line, marked Zimmermann's name on a list. Zimmermann was done 25 minutes early. He sat on a hay bale with 8 other prisoners who had also finished and waited for the truck to take them back to camp. That evening in the hut, Becker told Zimmermann about the Sunday arrangements. Sundays were rest days, no work. Prisoners could attend religious services, play football on the camp pitch, read books from the camp library, or participate in supervised activities organised by the camp administration. Zimmermann asked what kind of religious services. Becker said Protestant services were held in the camp chapel by visiting chaplains. Catholic services too, when priests were available. Zimmermann had not attended church in 3 years. He was not particularly religious, but the idea of any activity beyond work details seemed impossible. Becker said sometimes it was more than that. Sometimes, if behaviour was good and transport was available, small groups could attend services at local churches under guard. Supervised, but attend. Zimmermann thought Becker was exaggerating. He was not. On Saturday, April 21st, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a British Army sergeant named Davies walked through the camp compound announcing that 12 prisoners could volunteer for Sunday morning church attendance in Tenterden village. Supervised activity, 3-hour duration, returned by 1 o'clock. Zimmermann volunteered. He had not been outside the camp except for work details. The idea of seeing the inside of an English church seemed impossible. Prisoners did not attend civilian worship services. They stayed behind wire. But Becker had said it was real, and Zimmermann wanted to see if that was true. That was how Zimmermann ended up standing outside St Mildred's Church in Tenterden at 10:52 in the morning, watching Sergeant Davies hold the door open while telling him to enter. The church sat at the village centre, stone building, square tower, stained glass windows, catching morning light. Zimmermann could hear music inside. English voices, civilians, people whose country was at war with his country. Davies gestured again. Zimmermann stepped through the door. The interior was ancient, stone pillars supporting a vaulted ceiling, wooden pews arranged in rows facing an altar draped in white cloth. The room held maybe 60 people, men, women, children, elderly, sitting in the pews, standing with hymnals, singing. The singing stopped when Zimmermann and the other 11 Germans entered. Everyone looked. Zimmermann could see the recognition in their faces, POW patches on uniforms, German prisoners, enemy soldiers. The silence stretched for 7 seconds. Then the vicar at the front, an older man in white robes, nodded and gestured toward empty pews at the back of the church. Davies led the prisoners to the rear pews near the door. They sat on the hard wooden benches. The 4 guards positioned themselves along the side aisle, standing, watching, but not aggressively. The congregation slowly returned their attention to the front. The organ resumed playing. The singing continued, though quieter now, more tentative. Zimmermann sat in the pew and stared ahead. This was not supposed to happen. Wars did not include moments where enemies worshipped together in sacred spaces. But here it was, real, undeniable. The vicar waited for the hymn to finish, then spoke. His voice carried through the stone church. He welcomed everyone to the service, acknowledged that they were gathered in difficult times, reminded them that God's house was open to all who sought refuge and peace. He did not mention the prisoners directly, but Zimmermann felt the weight of the words. God's house was open to all. The service continued. Readings from Scripture, prayers for peace, for the end of suffering, for healing of nations. The vicar's voice was steady, measured, without anger or blame. He spoke of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of the possibility of restoration even after terrible destruction. Zimmermann understood perhaps half the English words, but he understood the tone. This was not a victory sermon. This was not triumphalism. This was something else. Lament, maybe. Hope, cautiously expressed. Then came another hymn. The congregation stood. The organ played the opening notes. The people began singing, and Zimmermann recognized the melody immediately. Abide with me. He knew this hymn. His mother had sung it in German when he was a child. Bleib bei mir, Herr. The same tune, the same slow, mournful cadence. The English words were different, but the meaning was the same. A prayer for God's presence in darkness. A plea for comfort in the face of death. Zimmermann stood because everyone else was standing. He did not sing. He could not. But he listened. The congregation sang all 5 verses. Their voices filled the church, merging into harmony that sounded nothing like military anthems Zimmermann remembered from Wehrmacht gatherings. This was different, vulnerable, honest. The singing acknowledged pain without demanding glory. By the 3rd verse, Zimmermann noticed one of the other prisoners, a young man named Fischer, was crying. Tears ran down Fischer's face, but he made no sound. He just stood there, in the back pew of an English church, weeping, while British civilians sang about the fading of life's little day. By the 4th verse, Zimmermann felt his own eyes burning. He had not cried since his brother died in Russia in 1943. He had not allowed himself to cry. Soldiers did not cry. But here, in this church, something broke. The hymn, the melody his mother had sung. The recognition that these English people were singing the same desperate prayer for God to stay with them through darkness, it was too much. When the hymn ended, the prisoners sat. Several were wiping their eyes. Fischer was still crying quietly. The guards made no move to intervene. They just watched, expressionless. The vicar offered another prayer. For those who had lost loved ones. For those far from home. For those suffering the consequences of war. For enemies to become neighbours. for hatred to be replaced with understanding. Zimmermann sat with his head bowed. He was not praying exactly. He was just trying to breathe. After the prayer, the vicar announced the final hymn. The congregation stood again. This time it was a song Zimmermann did not recognize. Something about a rock of ages. The people sang with more energy now, their voices stronger. This was clearly a familiar hymn, one they had sung many times. When the service concluded, the vicar spoke a benediction. May God grant peace. May God grant healing. May God grant wisdom to build a better world from the ruins of this one. The congregation began filing out through the side doors. Several people glanced at the prisoners as they passed, but no one spoke. Some faces showed curiosity, some showed nothing. A few showed what might have been pity. Davies stood and indicated it was time to leave. The prisoners rose and walked toward the main door. As they exited, the vicar stood in the doorway. He looked at each prisoner as they passed. When Zimmermann reached him, the vicar extended his hand. Zimmermann hesitated, then shook it. The vicar's grip was firm. He said something in English Zimmermann did not fully understand, but the tone was clear. Welcome. Peace be with you. Outside, the spring morning was bright. The prisoners climbed into the back of the truck and rode back to Camp 12 in silence. Zimmermann could not speak. He had nothing to say that would make sense of what had just happened. That afternoon, back in the hut, Zimmermann wrote a letter to his mother in Cologne. The letters were censored, so he could not write about camp locations or guard routines or anything military. He could only write about general conditions and his health. He wrote that he was safe, that the British were treating him according to the convention, that he had attended an English church service that morning. He knew his mother would not believe that last part. He barely believed it himself. But it had happened. The church visits continued through late April and into May. Every other Sunday, depending on transport availability and guard resources, prisoners who had maintained good behaviour could volunteer for supervised attendance at local churches. St. Mildred's in Tenterden, St. Mary's in Ashford, Holy Trinity in Rye. The visits always followed the same pattern. 12 prisoners, 4 guards, 3 hours including travel, returned by early afternoon. The guards always carried rifles, but they never needed them. No prisoner attempted to escape during these visits. Where would they go? They were in southern England, hundreds of miles from any neutral territory, wearing uniforms marked with POW. Escape was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. And most prisoners did not want to escape. The conditions at Camp 12 were better than the conditions they had experienced in the Wehrmacht during the final months of the war. Regular food, shelter, no artillery, no Allied bombing runs, no constant threat of death. Some prisoners called it surreal captivity, safe but completely alien. Zimmermann called it something else. He called it a glimpse of what mercy looked like when people chose to extend it. The alternative was remaining in Germany, which by April 1945 meant fighting in the ruins of cities against overwhelming Allied forces, or being sent to defend Berlin against Soviet armies that were destroying everything in their path. The alternative was death, or worse. So Zimmermann dug ditches, attended church when he could, read books in the hut, and waited for the war to end. The work on the farms continued through April. Zimmermann became efficient at manual labour. By his 5th week, he could complete his daily quota by 4:15 in the afternoon. That gave him 45 minutes of rest before the truck returned to camp. He spent that time sitting in barns, drinking water from the pump, watching British farm workers. The farmers changed occasionally. Some were older men, beyond military age. Others were younger men classified as essential agricultural workers and exempted from conscription. Some were women from the Women's Land Army, civilians doing farm work to replace men who had joined the forces. These workers seemed neither friendly nor hostile toward the German prisoners. They were pragmatic. The farms needed labour. The prisoners provided labour. Personal feelings were secondary to getting crops planted before the season advanced. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners heard the news that evening during roll call. The camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, announced that hostilities had ceased. Germany had capitulated unconditionally. The Third Reich was finished. Ashworth said the prisoners would remain in British custody. Repatriation would occur eventually, but not immediately. Germany was destroyed, its infrastructure collapsed. Transporting hundreds of thousands of prisoners back to a nation in chaos would take months, possibly years. Until then, the prisoners would continue working. Camp conditions would continue under Geneva Convention standards. Behaviour expectations remained unchanged. The prisoners accepted the announcement without protest. What could they say? The war was over. They had lost. But they were alive, and that counted for something. 2 days later, on May the 10th, the camp administration called another assembly. The prisoners gathered in the main compound yard. Ashworth stood on a platform with several other officers. His face was grim. News had reached Britain about German concentration camps. Photographs of Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau had been published in newspapers. Images of emaciated prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers. British soldiers had liberated the camps and documented what they found. Evidence of systematic murder on an unimaginable scale. Ashworth said the British government was demanding consequences. Parliament wanted German POWs to receive reduced rations as punishment. British civilians were outraged. Many were calling for harsher treatment of all German prisoners. Ashworth said he would follow orders from London, but he personally believed in maintaining Geneva Convention standards. Rations would be reduced, but only slightly. Work assignments would continue. Church privileges would be reviewed. The prisoners sat in silence. They had heard rumours during the war. Whispers about camps in Poland, about transports of Jews being sent east, about things soldiers were told not to discuss. Most had dismissed the rumours as propaganda, exaggerations, enemy lies designed to demonize Germany. But the photographs did not lie. British soldiers did not fabricate evidence. The testimony was too consistent, too detailed, too horrifying to dismiss. Zimmermann sat in his hut after the assembly and tried to process what he now understood. Germany had not just lost a war. Germany had committed atrocities that would stain the nation for generations. And he had been part of it. Not directly. He had been a tank driver in the Rhineland, not a guard at a camp. But he had worn the uniform. He had served the regime. He had believed its lies. That made him complicit. The other prisoners did not want to discuss it. They wanted to focus on survival, on getting home eventually, on starting over. Zimmermann could not focus on those things. The images stayed in his mind. The evidence would not fade. The church visits stopped after May 10th. Ashworth announced that recreational privileges were suspended pending review. The guards became more distant, more formal. The casual conversations stopped. The atmosphere in the camp changed. The war was over, but the moral reckoning was just beginning. Zimmermann remained at Camp 12 until January 1946. The repatriation process was slow. Thousands of German prisoners were held in camps across Britain, and transporting them back to Germany required coordination with British, American, and Soviet authorities, who were also managing millions of displaced persons across Europe. Zimmermann's turn came on January 14, 1946. He and 190 other prisoners were loaded onto buses and driven to Southampton, where they boarded a transport ship bound for Cuxhaven. The voyage took 3 days. Zimmermann spent most of the time below deck, staring at the metal bulkhead, thinking about the past 11 months. He had left Germany in February 1945 as a soldier. He was returning in January 1946 as a prisoner with memories of digging ditches in Kent and standing in an English church while British civilians sang hymns and a vicar shook his hand. The ship docked at Cuxhaven on January the 17th. British authorities processed the prisoners through a transit centre, then loaded them onto trains heading south. Zimmermann reached Cologne on January 20th. The city was ruins. Entire districts reduced to rubble by years of Allied bombing. The cathedral still stood, damaged but intact, surrounded by devastation. The streets were filled with refugees, former soldiers, displaced persons trying to find family members. Zimmermann found his mother living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed building in what remained of their old neighbourhood. His father had died in an air raid in 1944. His younger brother had been killed in Italy in 1944. His sister had survived and was living with relatives in the countryside. Zimmermann stayed with his mother in those 2 rooms and tried to find work. There was no work. The economy was destroyed. Currency was worthless. People traded cigarettes and food instead of money. Zimmermann used the skills he had learned in Britain. He found jobs in construction, clearing rubble, repairing buildings. The pay was minimal, but it bought food on the black market. He worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week, rebuilding a city that would take decades to restore. He never talked about Britain in detail. When people asked where he had been during the war, he said the Rhineland and left it at that. But he thought about Britain often. He thought about St. Mildred's Church in Tenterden, about the vicar shaking his hand. He thought about Sergeant Davies holding the door open. He thought about the absurdity of enemies standing together in a church singing about God's mercy during a war that had killed millions. And he realised something. The British had not been trying to humiliate him by taking him to church. They had been trying to remind him that he was still human, that war did not erase humanity, that even as prisoners, even as enemies, Germans deserved to be treated with basic dignity. That was the lesson he carried forward. Not that Britain was perfect, not that Germany was innocent, but that humanity could survive even in the worst circumstances if people chose to preserve it. Zimmermann lived in Cologne for the rest of his life. He married in 1950, had 2 sons, worked as a stonemason, eventually helped rebuild several churches damaged during the war. He never returned to Britain. He never tried to contact Sergeant Davies or the vicar or any of the guards and farmers he had known at Camp 12. But he kept one item from his time as a prisoner. A small piece of paper with the words to "Abide with me" written in English. He had copied them from a hymnal left in the camp chapel before repatriation. The paper was fragile, yellowed, with careful handwriting. Zimmermann kept the paper in a wooden box on his desk. His sons found it after he died in 1989. They asked their mother what it was. She said their father had been a prisoner of war in Britain during the war, and that the British had treated him with unexpected kindness. Better than he had expected, better than Germany had treated its enemies. The paper now sits in a small collection at the Romano-Germanic Museum in Cologne, in a section dedicated to the experiences of Cologne residents during and after World War II. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like any other artifact from the 1940s. A piece of paper with English words written in faded ink. But it is not. It is evidence of a moment when enemies were allowed to worship together on a Sunday morning in Kent. Evidence that proves even in war, even in captivity, even between nations that had tried to destroy each other, humanity can survive if people choose to preserve it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're sharing forgotten stories like this every single day. Real history, real people, real moments of humanity in impossible circumstances. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Britain, Germany, the United States, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. Let us know you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served during World War II or was held as a prisoner. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Klaus Zimmermann and the thousands of other POWs who experienced this strange mercy are not forgotten. These stories deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.